Today I thought I'd talk about books. Kindle kind of ruined reading for me in some ways, and I'm trying to do different things on this channel, which means I'm going to talk about books and some of the books that I've loved and why over the years. Now there are a lot of books here, so I'm not going to talk about them too in depth, but any book that I show you here is a book that I feel like is worth reading, no matter who you are, what age, whatever, genre you like. These are books. They transcend genre. They are something that speaks to the reader, regardless of what shelf they might put it on in the bookstore. Okay. And why might you want to pay attention to what I have to say about books? I wrote a book. This is the book I wrote. And I have other books that I have written but not published. I went to grad school for writing. Excuse me. I went to grad school for writing. Taught writing and literature for about 15 years before I became YouTube famous or whatever it is that I am. So maybe that's a good reason to listen to me. And these are in no order. I'm just going to talk about them and we're going to go through it. Now, this is James Joyce, Dubliners. His first collected published work of short stories. Okay, there are lots of whenever people talk about James Joyce, they always talk about Ulysses, they always talk about Finnegan's Wake, they talk about James Joyce like he's a sport that you have to be really accomplished in to understand. And yes, this book was published when originally published in 1914. So it's 122 years old, 112 years old. I'm not good at math. I'm good at books. This is some of the best writing that you will ever encounter. And by best, I mean not only accomplished, good use of words and stuff, but capturing a human condition. James Joyce grew up turn of the 20th century on the streets of Dublin. But the story that I go back to most often is the last story in the collection, which is called The Dead. And The Dead is more of a novella than a short story. There's a film starring Gabriel Byrne, Angelica Houston, and Gabriel Byrne. I think it was John Huston's last film. It's worth watching, but not in lieu of reading this. I've probably read this story 10 times. It's a Christmas story of a certain kind. And it is a story that occurs between two ages, one that was more formal and old-fashioned, and one that was more forward-thinking. And that's definitely something that is a stressor throughout the story. But it's really a love story of sorts. And I'm not going to give away too much about it, although I will say the final line in this story is one of the most amazing final lines. And I'm going to read it to you just so you can, it doesn't give away anything plot-wise, but when you get to it, it'll kick your ass. His soul swooned slowly as he heard the snow falling faintly through the universe, and the faintly falling like the descent of their last end upon all the living and the dead. James Joyce, Dubliners. Read it. Don't bother. I mean, if you want to read Ulysses or Finnegan's Wake, then yeah, okay. But so for this, at least as a as a way into the world of Joyce. What do we have next here? Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale. Now, I've taught this book several times. I've taught stories from Dubliners several times. This story that starts here, and she wrote a sequel to it called The Testaments that came out 2 years ago. But The Handmaid's Tale, if you've watched the TV show, now I love Elizabeth Moss, and I'm sure that that's prestige TV, but there are certain things that within 5 minutes of that TV show starting, I turned it off because I've read this book many times, and there are certain things about how this book is structured and why it works the way it does that they seem to have chosen to dispense with in the television show. So even if you've read the television or watched the television show, read this book. It is, if you're familiar with it, yes, it is a dystopian near future novel about totalitarianism and dictatorship and the concept of rights given versus rights owed. And yeah, there's a lot to it. And it's worth a read for sure. Next up, I could have picked any number of books by this guy, Ernest Hemingway. And I realized that over the years, the dead white American writers have gotten a bad rap, and Hemingway has been considered misogynistic or any other kind of thing. And I think that is such a limited reading of Hemingway's writing. His male and female characters exist in a time where the norms of that time were different than the norms of this time, and yet he puts his characters in these situations that are almost untenable, in part because of where they exist within that social structure. And then they act sometimes in a good way and sometimes in a bad way. For whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. This is just like any Hemingway is worth reading. I think my favorite Hemingway is A Farewell to Arms, which I couldn't find. It might be in the storage space. I had this on the shelves up there. If you want to read a book in a day, Old Man and the Sea, I read that book in a day when I was probably like 14 or 15. So anything by Hemingway, but, The Sun Also Rises, For Whom the Bell Tolls, Farewell to Arms, The Old Man and the Sea, those are kind of like the heavy hitters. Hemingway won the Nobel Prize for Literature. Okay, one of, I think, 7 or 8 American writers who have done that. And so to dismiss him, if you've done that, or your teachers have told you to do that, or whatever, is a silly thing to do. Read some Hemingway. Now, we come on to the first of what could be called genre fiction. This is The Postman Always Rings Twice by James M. Cain. It is a slim volume, and I'll just read you the blurb on the back, because this is a mystery that I don't want to give away, but it's an amoral young tramp, a beautiful sullen woman with an inconvenient husband, a problem that has only one grisly solution, a solution that only creates other problems that no one ever can solve. I don't want to tell you more about the book, except for James M. Cain is one of the Mount Rushmore mystery writers. I don't see him talked about on the BookTok or BookTube. I don't see a lot of these writers discussed on the BookTube all that much. I see a lot of more modern writers, and I'm old, and I've read lots of books. And my favorites are still the old ones. if you want to read some really incredible prose, a Pulitzer Prize winning book about a former sports writer who becomes a real estate agent, then Richard Ford's Independence Day is the place to start. The Sports Writer was the first book, and then Independence Day is later on. I think there have been 4 or 5 books with this same Frank Bascom character in it. Yeah, you really have to. I always think about this when I try and, like, this is not an older book to me because this was published like when I was an adult, but a lot of people these days will think about this as an older book. I've tried to get my daughter to read these older classic books that I love, but it's not the thing that she's into. She's into the YA and the what was the word that I heard? Romantasy the other day. That was an interesting word. I don't think she reads romantasy, but she does read fantasy. Sports writer Frank Bascom, in the aftermath of his divorce and the ruin of his career, has entered an existence period selling real estate in Haddam, New Jersey. Sounds not too exciting, but it's an incredibly good book. Flannery O'Connor, the OG of American short story writers, also went to the school that I went to. Flannery O'Connor is one of those American writers that, because she didn't write big novels, she mostly is known for her short stories, although Wise Blood, her book, is very well accepted as a masterpiece as well. Flannery O'Connor sometimes gets left behind, and because she, for lack of a better word, in the time was maybe because of her gender or whatever, she doesn't get credit for what a badass she really is when she really digs into the characters that she writes about. And her most famous story, the one that's most read elsewhere, is A Good Man is Hard to Find. It's on page 117 of this book. A Good Man is Hard to Find is not about a good man. It's about a car trip with friends, let's say. It is weird. It is violent. It is out there, for sure. And toward the end of the story, one of the characters says she would have been a good woman if it had somebody there to shoot her every minute of her life. Put that in your pipe and smoke it. Read some Flannery O'Connor. Jane Austen, Pride and Prejudice. Now, maybe you've seen a film adaptation of this book. I have taught this book many times, as you could tell. I have pages marked. This is not my first copy of this book, and it is a used and very beaten copy of this book. But this book chronicles Elizabeth Bennet, a coquettish young woman in England who is a little bit more independent than most women are encouraged to be in that time. And then she meets Mr. Darcy, who is also a nobleman, and, like all that, but a little bit, it's a love story. It's also a study in society and how society tries to put you in boxes. And it's a great book. You might think, oh, well, it's old. It's super old. Jane Austen's been dead for, over 100 years or something. Trust me. This is one of the favorite books that I've taught that, according to my students, one of their favorite books that they have read. They've enjoyed it when they thought that they wouldn't. And so I heartily recommend Pride and Prejudice. Now, we're getting into some short story stuff here. Denis Johnson. Denis Johnson also went through my graduate program, and this slim collection of stories is mostly centered around some fictionalized, like Iowa City, where the school is, but some fictionalized scenarios. They did make kind of an adaptation of this where the stories wove together, but it's a very difficult book to describe. Denis Johnson is a very difficult writer to describe. And I don't know if I should say a whole lot about this, except that you should read it, and you should read Emergency. Emergency is the story that you want to read, but any of them are fantastic. The title comes from this big red emergency sign that was over the entrance to the emergency room portico at Mercy Hospital in Iowa City. And I'll just read you the first few lines. I'd been working in the emergency room for about 3 weeks, I guess. This was 1973, before the summer ended. With nothing to do on overnight shift but batch the insurance reports from the daytime shift, I just started wandering around over to the coronary unit, down to the cafeteria, etc., looking for Georgie, the orderly, a pretty good friend of mine. He often stole pills from the cabinets. When a story starts with pills, you know it's going to be a good story. There are also baby rabbits. Raymond Carver. This is the only Raymond Carver book I have in my house right now, but it doesn't contain my favorite Raymond Carver story, which is called A Small Good Thing. And if I were to, A Small Good Thing is about a young boy walking to school who gets hit by a car and ends up in the hospital. But it's not about, it's not like an episode of, Grey's Anatomy or something. It's not a procedural. It's about the connection between human beings and how our society clips that connection and doesn't allow us to really see one another until we do. So Raymond Carver, in general, is one of the best writers I've ever read. And one of the reasons I wanted to become a writer. I read A Small Good Thing when I was in college and just said to myself, I want to be able to do that. So A Small Good Thing, Raymond Carver. I had to throw you something somewhat modern that I think is pretty awesome and has some tangential tech content for those of you who stuck around. Jennifer Egan's A Visit from the Goon Squad. This is a book that takes a lot of different characters and a lot of different things and sort of pulls them all together. There's like a lot of music content, but I've read a lot of music books that are just really kind of like they don't get the music right. This book gets the music right. It gets the characters right. It gets the time right. It gets the moment in time where it's set right. And Jennifer Egan is a great writer. In fact, I love this book so much that I found Jennifer Egan on Facebook and I wrote her a Facebook message saying how much I love this book. And she sent me a message back saying thank you. And before she was a writer, when she was young, she dated Steve Jobs. So there you go. Revolutionary Road by Richard Yates. Now there was a film made of this movie starring Leonardo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet. Their first film together since Titanic. And whereas Titanic was depressing in like a satisfying way, Revolutionary Road is depressing in the sort of like I want to go out and like, undo myself kind of way. This is the most depressing book that I've ever read, and I have read it 3 or 4 times. Revolutionary Road is a book that came out, publication 1961. There were not really other books like this in 1961. Kurt Vonnegut, on the back cover here, called it the Great Gatsby of my time, one of the best books by a member of my generation. It follows a couple who are going through, I guess, like an early midlife thing, and I can't tell you more and do it justice, but the ending of this left me in tears, like honest to God, literal tears. And regardless of the time, regardless of the setting, regardless of the place, this book is a kick in the nuts in all the right ways, if that makes any sense. It's a tough book, and I don't want to tell you about it because I want you to read it. Revolutionary Road by Richard Yates. Now, I want to take a second and talk about a writer that I see talked about quite frequently on the BookTok. And one particular book by this writer that everyone talks about. Okay, so the particular book that everyone talks about is this book, Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy, or An Evening Redness in the West. This book is a mindfuck in so many ways. People call it a Western. I don't know if it's a Western. It is at some times like just insane. It is at some times you don't know what's happening. It shifts points of view. It goes all over the place. There's a kid, there's a judge, there's all this other stuff. Things that stand out to you when you read this book. Early on in the book, some Native Americans attack a camp and they find a baby, okay? And they grab the infant by its feet and they spin it around, and its brain comes out the fontanelle of the baby's head. That is maybe the most violent and inventive, disgusting thing that I've ever read in my life. If you don't know what a fontanelle is, it's the soft spot on a baby's head. And that takes a long time for the skull to knit itself together. So they say don't hit a baby on the top of the head. They also make dynamite out of bat guano. Guano is shit. Again, a book that's really I've taught this book 3 or 4 times, and each time the slack-jawed sort of confusion and then excitement and then fear that happens is... So people say, oh, read this book. And again, it's one of those books that people say, oh, man, Blood Meridian. And they talk about it like, it's climbing a mountain or something. It is a very good book. It is not the first Cormac McCarthy book that you should pick up. Some might say pick up some of his older books, and they are very good. Outer Dark, Child of God, those are really good books. Suttree, really good book. But Cormac McCarthy kind of had 2 periods in his career. One was, I guess, the early period, and then the later period. And the later period was kind of marked by this book, and then this book. All the Pretty Horses was Cormac McCarthy's breakthrough novel. He'd written 10 novels before All the Pretty Horses became popular, won the National Book Award, And it is a much more accessible story set in a very similar setting to Blood Meridian. And it is a great story. It's the beginning of a trilogy. You can go through the whole trilogy. There was a film starring Matt Damon way back in the day. It was a fair but not transcendent adaptation of the book. But All the Pretty Horses is a story about a kid who, kind of takes off, and it's the 40s, and he ends up down in Mexico, and that's Cormac McCarthy for you. The characters are always traveling. They're always in between places, and they're never sure where they're going. And they're put through some tribulations. Okay. If we want to get biblical about it, you might recognize that story. But All the Pretty Horses is a book to read. No Country for Old Men, which I think came out in 2004. The movie, this is the only book where the movie and the book are like good enough to be talked about in the same sentence. And again, it is about a guy who is a veteran, Llewellyn Moss, and he finds money in the desert after he finds like the carnage of a Mexican drug exchange gone bad, finds $2 million in a satchel, decides to take the satchel, that being the original sin, right? And then he is hunted down for taking the money. And the whole time you're rooting for him and you want him to succeed. But in the hands of Cormac McCarthy, there's some part of you that knows that he shouldn't succeed. Anton Chigurh is maybe one of the best villains ever made in all of American literature or all literature. I don't know. And was played to perfection in the film. If you know what I'm talking about, you know what I'm talking about. But even if you've seen the film, you must read this book, maybe twice. It's really good. And then we get to the book that maybe I have taught the most of any book, and that is Cormac McCarthy's The Road. The Road is the story of a father and son who are traveling through the ruined landscape of a dead America, a dead world. They're trying to get south where they hope it will be warmer and they won't die. And yes, it sounds like, another dystopian novel about survival. It is not about survival. It is perhaps about preparing your children to survive you on some level. But again, at moments very violent, at moments very poignant, at moments just heartbreaking. And the language is different than most Cormac McCarthy. I mean, he's always got a very sort of like poetic style to his language, doesn't use quotation marks and that kind of thing. But this book reads almost like a prose poem. When he woke in the woods in the dark and the cold of the night, he reached out to touch the child sleeping beside him. Nights dark beyond darkness, and the days more gray each one than what had gone before, like the onset of some cold glaucoma dimming away the world. Lift that out, put it in couplets. It's poetry, and the whole book is like this. The writing is beautiful, the story is beautiful. People reduce it to something about, dystopian survival, but it's not that. It is a beautiful book about a father and son and what it means to pass on the goodness that you have in the most difficult situation at odds that are really almost impossible to overcome. Let's see, what else do we have here? East of Eden. This was the first literary novel I ever read. This is the copy that was on my grandparents' shelf. I still have like this much of the dust jacket. And it is John Steinbeck can write the world that he lives in. And you feel when you're reading John Steinbeck like you're living in that world. But it's very biblical, and it's like the importance of the story and the actions of the characters and everything else feels very, very important, like life and death, and oftentimes they are. East of Eden is a family story about the dynamics of generations, and it is beautifully written. That this was the first book that I read of, this caliber was a pure accident. It was on my grandparents' shelf. I think my mom or my aunt or uncle had bought it. It was a popular novel at the time when they were young, and it was just still sitting there. And I visited them for the summer for a couple of weeks every year, and I often read a lot of books while I was there. I didn't have a new book after I'd finished one. I picked this up off the shelf, and I could not put it down. It was a revelation to me. Like, I'd been reading books about, the Vietnam War, like paperback novels and stuff, and comic books. I started out with comic books. I love comic books. We're going to talk about a comic book here in a second. But this book showed me something I hadn't seen before and sent me down a path that, led me to become a writer myself. Let's see here. This is the book that I just finished reading called FantasticLand by Mike Bockoven. This is a newer novel, and actually I really enjoyed it. When I decided not to read on the Kindle anymore, right before Christmas, I went and I got like 4 or 5 books. This was the first one of them that I read, and it's about an amusement park very much in the vein of a Disney World or a Universal Studios or something like that. And there's a hurricane that sort of swamps people into this park, the employees that have stayed behind to try and keep the park in good repair until they're rescued or the floods go down or something like that. They end up being there for like 4 or 5 weeks, and stuff happens. It's got a little tinge of Lord of the Flies to it, but I really enjoyed it. It's written in a style where there's a journalist that's writing a book about the events during and after the storm, and he's interviewing people who have survived from all these different people who are of different factions and had different experiences. FantasticLand. Worth reading. The book I'm reading right now is The Reluctant Sheriff by one of my teachers and great inspirations and good friends, Chris Offutt. He was my first teacher in grad school. Someday I will tell the story of my first submission to workshop when I got to grad school and the absolute dressing down that I received, not just during the workshop, but beforehand. This is, I think, the 5th book in this series. Chris is an amazing writer. He has such this doesn't even sound like the right description, but an economy of words that put you in that should give you the character and the place and the event without having to go through all of the rigmarole of over explaining, over describing, any of those kinds of things. And I've read so many mystery novels that are so badly written that sometimes I can't even get past the first sentence or paragraph. I just can't do it because it's imprecise. Okay, the person is trying to tell a story, but they don't have the skills necessary to make that story real. And they just have words, not well-considered words, sentences, not well-constructed sentences, that a writer of the caliber of Chris Offutt is writing mystery novels is a good thing, because these are really good books. Set in Kentucky, I guess you call them rural noir now. Former Army CID officer comes back to his hometown in Kentucky, ends up, being thrown into some situations where he's helping the sheriff and his sister, who's a deputy, and then a sheriff. Read the first book. I'm going to make sure I remember what the first book is called. If I should be okay. He's written. This is the fourth book. Okay. There are 3 of these Mick Harden novels: The Killing Hills, Shifty's Boys, Code of the Hills, and The Reluctant Sheriff. This is the next to last book that I'm going to talk about. This is Gilead by Marilynne Robinson, who also was a teacher at my grad school. But this is the story of a minister in Iowa, and it's set back in, I believe, the late 40s or early 50s, this book. And it's impossible for me to really, Gilead is the name of the town. It's impossible for me to describe to you what this book is. It is the story of this man's life, and you uncover the things that he's gone through and experienced. But it resonates in such a way that only someone like Marilynne Robinson could write this very simple story that in the hands of a different writer would have seemed very basic and probably boring. But this book, which I have taught and read probably 4 or 5 times, winner of the Pulitzer Prize, I believe in 2005. It's just a book that can't fully be described. I mean, there's, incandescent, magnificent, a literary miracle, so serenely beautiful and written in a prose so gravely measured and thoughtful that one feels touched with grace just to read it. None of those things do justice to the experience you will have when you read this book. And there are further books in this series. And the story of this book is that, so she wrote a book called Housekeeping when she was younger, and I think it took her like 20 plus years to write her next book. 24 years after her first novel. And she had been working on this book for a long time. And the minister was a tertiary, secondary character. And then one day, she just kind of had this epiphany about how the whole story was about the minister and his life. And she wrote it, and that draft is pretty much what they published. So this is like almost like a divinely given thing. There are more books. Home is one. There was a more recent one. I think there are 4 books that John Ames is the main character in. So check this out. The final book that I want to talk about is this one, Watchmen. This is absolute Watchmen. It doesn't have vodka in it. It's it is like a gigantic compendium version of the book. This is a comic book, or as they've come to be known, a graphic novel. I don't know that graphic novel really does it justice. Okay, this was the first thing that could be called a graphic novel. It's a collection of issues of a series that lent themselves to being collected as a book. This was on the only comic book on the Time magazine best 100 novels of the 20th century. And it follows these characters who seem quite outlandish. This is Dr. Manhattan. He was caught in some kind of experiment that made him infinite. And he doesn't connect with the world anymore, but the world still goes on around him. And he's basically, he has all the power that he could ever want. And then there's other characters. There's the comedian. The film that Zack Snyder made is very, very faithful to the book, which I thought was a good thing. But sometimes being faithful to the book in a film doesn't always work. And that, I still love that movie, but some people don't like it. But this is something that I was teaching at a small liberal arts college, and this was on the assignment list. And I remember students coming to me saying, my parents are really confused, like that you are making us read a comic book. I took issue with the making us read a comic book. It was a literature class. It was an elective. You could have not taken the class. But I said, trust me, and tell your parents to trust me. You will read this book, and it will be as resonant and satisfying and deep and meaningful as any novel I could assign you. And the discussions that we had in class about this book were so much more boisterous and just everybody was at first shocked at how much they were getting from reading this book, and then how much it was resonating with them. It's political, it's interpersonal, it's intergenerational, and it's about absolute power. And the nature of that, whether or not it exists, and if it does, what does it mean? If you haven't read this, now you don't have to buy this giant version. This was me buying something special for myself, but it's available on Comixology if you want to get it and read it on your iPad, or you can get it pretty much in any store. Best comic book ever written? Probably so. Alan Moore, Dave Gibbons. Alan Moore is probably accepted as like maybe the top of the Mount Rushmore of comic book writers. And this is a fantastic thing to read. You might pick it up thinking like, oh, I'll read something light. It is not light. And so that is a long video about books. Books that I love, books that I've taught, books that taught me, books that I am inspired by or have been at some point. I'll put links to all these books down there as well. I'll make a little playlist or wish list or whatever it is, and then I'll share that. But I mean, I've always loved books. And I never really could figure out, like, well, how do I talk about books on YouTube? Because YouTube has to be like, "Wah!" crazy. But I'm doing it. If you want me to do more, let me know down in the comments. I have some more things that I have planned. Subscribe if you want to see that. And otherwise, till the next time, I'll see you.